There is a car that saved BMW. Not in the way marketing departments talk about saving things, not with a record-breaking engine, not with a visionary CEO on a stage. This car saved BMW in the most unglamorous way possible. It showed up at exactly the right moment, did exactly what was needed, and then quietly disappeared while everything it made possible got all the credit. Most people who follow cars have never heard the name. It was called the BMW 700, built between 1959 and 1965. A small, rear-engined car with a motorcycle engine and an Italian-designed body. And if that description makes it sound trivial, that's exactly the illusion this video is going to break apart. Because here's what actually happened. In the late 1950s, BMW was not the brand you know today. It was not the benchmark for driving dynamics. It was not the aspirational symbol that fills motorway lanes from Los Angeles to London. BMW in 1958 was a company in genuine, serious trouble. The kind of trouble where the word liquidation gets used in board meetings without anyone flinching. The product line was a disaster, and not in a subtle way. On one end, BMW sold enormous hand-built luxury cars, the 501 and the 502, beautifully crafted. Expensive, commercially indefensible, they became known almost sarcastically as the Baroque Angels. On the other end sat the Isetta, a bubble car, something that looked like it had been designed by an engineer who had never actually been outside. The Isetta kept the lights on, just barely. And between those two extremes, nothing, a void, no family car, no volume seller. No product for the millions of ordinary Europeans who were, for the first time since the war, earning enough to consider buying a car. That gap was killing BMW, slowly, then all at once. The part nobody tells you, the part that makes this story worth your time, is just how close the whole thing came to ending. What stood between BMW's survival and its complete disappearance was a boardroom in Munich, a dentist from Frankfurt who refused to stay quiet, and a small rear-engined car that had just made its public debut for the very first time. Pay close attention to what comes next, because this is where history quietly decided to go a different way. December 9th, 1959, Munich, the annual BMW shareholders meeting. On paper, a routine gathering. In reality, an execution in slow motion, and almost everyone in the room knew it. Deutsche Bank, one of BMW's principal creditors, arrived with a proposal that was, from a purely financial standpoint, perfectly logical. BMW should be absorbed into Daimler-Benz, folded into Mercedes. The brand, the factories, the workers handed over to Stuttgart. BMW would cease to exist as an independent company. The logic was hard to argue with. BMW had been losing money for years. The luxury cars weren't selling in the volumes needed. The Isetta was never going to carry a company on its own. Deutsche Bank wasn't being cruel, they were being rational. And rational, in that room on that December morning, meant it's over. There was just one problem. Not everyone in that room was interested in being rational. Among the shareholders was a group of smaller investors, private individuals who had held stock not out of financial strategy but because they believed in the company. One name that survives in the historical record is Friedrich Mathern, a dentist from Frankfurt who owned BMW shares and had absolutely no intention of watching them become Mercedes-Benz shares. Mathern and others like him refused to vote for the merger. They caused enough disruption that the vote could not be pushed through cleanly. It bought time, not much, but enough. Also in that room was Herbert Quandt. He had inherited a substantial stake in BMW through his family, not a car man by training, an industrialist, a businessman. But watching the company teeter on the edge of absorption, he made a decision that had no guaranteed outcome. He committed to investing further, buying additional shares during the meeting and in the weeks that followed, effectively betting his own capital on the idea that BMW could survive independently. That bet required something to be true. It required a viable product, a reason to believe the company could generate real revenue and build something worth building. And that product had already been unveiled. 2 months earlier, In September 1959, at the Frankfurt Motor Show, BMW had shown the world the 700 for the first time, not a concept, not a promise. A real car, ready for production, aimed directly at the gap that had been draining the company for years. Herbert Quandt had seen it, and he believed it was enough. What he was really betting on, without perhaps framing it in exactly these terms, was a small rear-engined car with a motorcycle engine and a body drawn by an Italian designer most people had never heard of. The fate of BMW came down to that. And what made that car worth betting on is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Let's talk about the car itself. Because once you understand what the 700 actually was, how it was built, who designed it, the story stops being about corporate survival and becomes about something more interesting. The difference between a product that merely exists and a product that earns its place. The body was the work of Giovanni Michelotti. If that name doesn't immediately land, here's the context. Michelotti was one of the most sought-after independent designers in Europe at the time. He drew cars for Triumph, for Lancia, for De Tomaso. He had an instinct for proportion, for making something look right, even when the engineering brief was working against him. And the brief for the 700 was not easy. Small footprint, rear engine, tight budget. Make it look like a real car, not an afterthought. He delivered. The 700 didn't look apologetic. It had clean, balanced lines, a shape that said, "This is a car for someone who has somewhere to go." In a market segment that often produced vehicles that seemed embarrassed to exist, Michelotti gave BMW something with actual dignity. Underneath that body was an engineering decision that still raises eyebrows. BMW chose to build the 700 on a tubular space-frame chassis, the kind of architecture normally reserved for sports cars and racing machines, more complex to manufacture. An expensive choice for an inexpensive car. But it gave the 700 rigidity and handling that its competitors simply couldn't match. Then there was the engine. BMW didn't develop something new, they didn't have the budget or the time. Instead, they turned to their own motorcycle division, an air-cooled flat twin displacing 697 cubic centimeters, 30 horsepower in standard form, 40 in the sport version. Those numbers sound modest now. In 1960, in a car weighing under 600 kilograms, they were enough to make the 700 genuinely alive by the standards of the class. The result was a car that was, by every practical measure, better than it had any right to be. Affordable to buy, economical to run, capable enough to be driven with real enthusiasm. Variants included the two-door limousine, the elegantly proportioned coupe, and a cabriolet. In the language of 1960s, Europe, a continent still rediscovering what prosperity felt like, the 700 was the right car at the right moment. The market responded. 188,000 units across 6 years of production. That wasn't a curiosity number. That was a production car doing its job. But the real consequence of those sales wasn't the revenue itself. It was what that revenue made possible next. And that part of the story changes everything you think you know about BMW. Money buys time. That's the unglamorous truth behind almost every corporate survival story ever told. Not vision, not genius, not the right speech at the right moment. Time. The ability to keep the doors open long enough for the next thing to become real. The 700 gave BMW that time. The revenue coming in from 700 sales, modest per unit, but consistent, accumulating across months and then years, funded a development program the company could not have afforded without it. That program had a name that translated simply as the new class, in German, Neue Klasse. The BMW 1500 was unveiled at the Frankfurt Motor Show in September 1961, 2 years after the 700 had debuted at the very same show. The symmetry is almost too neat, but it's real. The 1500 was a completely different kind of BMW. Front engine, rear-wheel drive, a proper 4-cylinder producing 80 horsepower. Independent suspension at all 4 corners, with geometry that prioritized driver engagement in a way that was unusual for a family car. It was the first BMW to clearly articulate what the brand would eventually stand for, the idea that a practical, everyday car could also be something you actually wanted to drive. The platform evolved. The 202 arrived a two-door version with a 2-liter engine that became, almost accidentally, one of the most influential performance cars of its generation. From the 202, the line runs direct, the first 3 series, the M cars, the entire sporting saloon philosophy that BMW has been selling for more than half a century. Every time someone talks about BMW's driving dynamics the way a 3 Series corners, what an M3 feels like on a back road, they are describing something that traces back, link by link, to that development program, the one the 700 funded, the one that wouldn't have existed without 188,000 small sales, adding up to something large enough to matter. Remove the 700 from that chain and the chain breaks. There is no 1500 without the 700's revenue. There is no Neue Klasse without Herbert Quant's bet, and there is no Quant bet without a viable product already on the show floor in Frankfurt in September 1959. The car that nobody remembers is the reason the cars that everybody admires exist. That's not a metaphor. That's the sequence of events as they actually happened. But there's one more dimension to the 700 story that almost never gets told, because this car didn't just save BMW financially, it went racing. And what happened on the circuits of early 1960s, Europe tells you something about what BMW needed to prove not to the market, but to itself. And the name attached to that racing story is one that will genuinely surprise you. There is an image in the historical record that I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. Hans Stuck, Sr., not the racing driver you may know from the 1980s, his son, also Hans, who competed in Formula One and sports cars. The father, Hans Stuck Sr., who had been one of the most celebrated racing drivers in Europe before the Second World War. A man who had piloted Auto Union Grand Prix cars, those extraordinary, terrifying rear-engined machines that contested the highest levels of European motor racing in the 1930s. A name spoken with genuine weight in any conversation about speed. In 1961, Hans Stuck Sr. climbed into a BMW 700 Sport and went racing. Take a moment with that. A pre-war Grand Prix legend, sitting in a rear-engine city car with a 697 cubic centimeter flat twin producing 40 horsepower, competing in European touring car events against other small displacement machines. The image is almost absurd, and it is completely real. BMW didn't enter the 700 in motorsport by accident or sentiment. The decision was strategic. The company's sporting reputation, formidable in the pre-war years, had effectively gone dark during the financial difficulties of the 1950s. When a manufacturer stops competing, the public memory fades faster than anyone in the marketing department wants to admit. BMW needed to remind Europe that it built machines that moved with intent. The 700 Sport delivered, its lightweight construction, that tubular space frame paying dividends now, and its willing engine, made it a genuine proposition in its class. Results accumulated. Not headline-grabbing overall victories against Ferraris and Jaguars, but real documented class wins that meant something. Motorsport coverage in the early 1960s reached audiences that advertising couldn't buy. A race result in a Saturday newspaper was credibility that no showroom campaign could manufacture. It also did something internal. Inside a company that had spent years in financial difficulty, watching a product succeed on a circuit timed by officials, reported in the press, does something to morale that balance sheets cannot. It reminded the people building BMWs that they were part of something worth building. Now, if this story is landing the way I think it is, then you already know this channel is where the history that actually matters gets told. The real sequence of events, with the real names and the real stakes. Subscribe right now if you haven't already. Hit the bell so these videos reach you when they drop. Leave a comment below, tell me what you knew about the BMW 700 before today, and what surprised you most. If this changed how you see automotive history, share it with one person who cares about cars. One click. They'll thank you for it. Now, back to the question sitting underneath this entire story. If the 700 did all of this, saved the company, funded the future, raced and won, why does almost nobody remember it? That answer is more uncomfortable than you might expect. History is not a fair record. It never has been. History is shaped by what was dramatic enough to remember, and edited often unconsciously by what came immediately before and after. The BMW 700 falls directly into one of history's most reliable blind spots. It was necessary without being spectacular, and it was followed immediately by something that was both. Think about how the story gets told in retrospect. Before the 700, BMW had the Isetta, peculiar, charming, impossible to ignore. A bubble car with a front-opening door that looks like a prop from a science fiction film. It became a cultural object collected, photographed, displayed in museums, strange enough to be unforgettable. Then, the moment the 700's production run ends, BMW produces the Neue Klasse, the 1500, the 202, the direct ancestors of everything the brand became. Celebrated with full justification. When enthusiasts trace the bloodline of the M3, they go straight to the Neue Klasse with reverence. Rightly so. The 700 sits between those two chapters. Behind it, the Isetta, too strange to forget. Ahead of it, the Neue Klasse, too important to ignore. And in the middle, a competent, well-engineered, commercially successful car that was neither strange nor grand, simply necessary. And necessity, in the historical record, is almost always invisible. There is a particular cruelty in that invisibility when you understand the sequence. The Neue Klasse could not have existed without the 700's revenue. The connection is direct and documented. And yet the car that funded everything receives almost none of the credit for what that funding produced. It happens in companies, it happens in wars, it happens in science. The unglamorous intermediate step, the one that bought time, that bridged the gap, gets erased from popular memory because it doesn't fit the narrative arc people prefer. People prefer a story that goes from crisis directly to triumph. The bridge between those two moments is harder to celebrate. Friedrich Mathen, the dentist who stood up in that Munich boardroom, is not a household name. Herbert Quandt is known only to those who follow the history closely. Giovanni Michelotti, who gave the 700 its dignity, is remembered by design historians and invisible to everyone else. The 700 is the same, present at the most important moment in BMW's modern history, doing everything asked of it, and then quietly leaving the stage in 1965 when the job was done and the next thing was ready. That is the most BMW thing about the whole story. Every institution that survives a crisis survives because of something unglamorous. The things that save us are rarely the things we celebrate. And now you know which car saved BMW, how it did it, and exactly why history forgot to say thank you. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. This is where the real history lives, not the polished version. Hit the like button if this landed. Drop a comment below telling me what you knew about the 700 before today or what hit hardest. And if you know someone who genuinely cares about cars or history, send this to them right now. One click. The BMW 700 deserved to be remembered. Now you've made sure it is.